preparations continue there in Cairo, hours after the military has ousted the country's first democratically elected president, President Morsi. In a nationwide televised address, Egypt's military chief suspended the country's constitution and implemented a transition plan. We've got some details of that plan in our hot sheet. Take a look. The head of Egypt's constitutional court is to be appointed as an interim head of state. The military is calling for the court to revise the country's election law to allow for presidential and parliamentary elections soon. The military also appointed a panel to review the constitution and a national reconciliation committee, which would include youth movements, many of whom were behind, of course, the rallies that you're seeing unfold in Cairo today. Does the military's plan provide a real solution to Egypt's political crisis? And a year after the country elected its first democratically chosen president, what happened? Joining me from Toronto is the Vice President of the Canadian Arab Federation, Mohamed El Rashidy, and with him, Janice Stein, Director of the Munk School of Global Affairs. Good to see you both to try and sort out this amazing and remarkable story that we are seeing unfold in Egypt today. Thank you for being here. Mohamed El Rashidy, let's start with you. The supporters of President Morsi are calling this a military coup. The military saying it is not. Who is right, and why would it matter?
Well, I think it would matter because of the future down the road. But beyond the semantics, I think it's very difficult to call it a military coup in my view, simply because of the fact that you've had a very, very popular protest on June the 30th that was organized over a long period of time that was led by all segments of society, and it numbered in the tens of millions, and the estimates are as high as 22 million. So I find it hard with the 22 million unarmed civilians to be called a military coup when they come out and peacefully call for the removal of the president. And obviously there are a lot of reasons for that we can get into, but it's difficult to call that a military coup when it's such a popular uprising that wasn't done in the middle of the night and so on. You even had warnings ahead of it saying the military over several weeks, including the last 48 hours, making it very clear there is a deadline to this situation.
And Janice Stein, from what I understand, it becomes difficult for Western democracies or administrations if it is a military coup, because it makes it almost impossible to help Egypt move forward. So perhaps it's just a question of semantics there.
Well, it's more than that, because if you call it a military coup, then, for example, the United States president is forced to suspend military aid, which is in the billions to Egypt. I think if we just get away from the legalities, of course it was a coup, right? The army dismissed the president. There were tanks in the street at the end. It does not look a lot like most coups, however, for two reasons. One, for the reason that Mohamed just mentioned, that this was the slowest unfolding coup one could imagine. With 20 million people in the street, we've all watched it, literally unfold in front of our eyes since June the 30th. But more to the point, immediately they have handed over power to the president of the Constitutional Court, Hakim Mansour. So there is not a general. They've committed themselves to a timetable for elections, and they have suspended a constitution, which is what happens in coups. But this particular constitution was the most contested. Morsi did not build a broad coalition behind it when he forced it through parliament. So we're in a gray zone, frankly, here.
Let's talk about Mohamed El Rashidy, about what started it. Yes, it didn't happen overnight, although it seems like it did. It was a slow build of people, a failure, I guess, by the Muslim Brotherhood to give any concessions to the more secular opposition. Also, more practical, concrete things: fuel shortages, ongoing problems with employment, the treatment of women. What do you think can be pointed to as how we got here again so quickly?
Well, when you make a very good question, obviously the answer is very long.
Yes.
Essentially, when you make over 20 million people angry enough to do what they did, which is non-violent, but nonetheless it requires a lot of sacrifice, go out on the streets in unison, call for you to leave your job, essentially fire you in the manner that they did, obviously you had to do a lot of missteps. And that's what happened with Morsi. Morsi here. You've named some of the things, but essentially Morsi came in with a sliver of a majority in an election against what was the former Prime Minister of Hosni Mubarak, and therefore he had a very thin mandate, but he was given the trust of the people to build institutions, to build this country from the ground up as a democracy, and there was some patience there in the beginning. And even though he won by a very small margin, clearly everybody sort of gave him that opportunity. He had several cards at his disposal, including the most important one, which is the Egyptian people in mass numbers, Tahrir Square, and so on. What he ended up doing, and we can get into all kinds of details, but what he ended up doing was he lost the trust of the people through various missteps, through actions that clearly exposed the Muslim Brotherhood, at least Morsi and his very small group, not being, if you could say, qualified, or certainly not being honest in the direction that they were taking the country. And the people said, we had enough. And I want to get into the minority issue here for a second. Women, as well as particularly Coptic Christians, we don't talk about that enough. I think the idea that Coptic Christians in particular felt so threatened in Egypt under Morsi is something that he needed to address. And he did so in the first few days. He seemed open to the idea. He seemed to address it directly, but not enough. And that was an important part of his job, I think, to get international legitimacy as well as the legitimacy of the elites. And the Christians in Egypt, you have to understand, are a fundamental part of the fabric of the society. Just like the Nile runs through Egypt, the Coptic Christians run through the history of Egypt. Yes. And asking them to leave or putting pressure on them to leave, as some extremists have done that were allied with the government, is like asking the Sphinx to get up and leave Egypt. It's just not going to happen.
Except Janice Stein, yes, he should have been more inclusive and tried to build coalitions with all these various groups that Mohamed El Rashidy is talking about. However, you could also argue that Egyptians didn't give him a lot of time to do it. Well, and should they have given him longer to turn things around?
Yeah, he faced an enormous challenge, and he was probably the wrong person to meet the challenge. He came, he was not the first choice for the brothers actually to run. Their first choice was disqualified because, ironically, he had been imprisoned under Mubarak. So Morsi did not, first of all, have the kind of political skills that we're talking about. He could not reach out, and when you win by 51%, you have no choice but to reach out. But let's talk about something else, which is the Egyptian economy, which frankly has gone into free fall over the last 6 to 8 months. Tourism revenue way down. The fuel shortages and the electricity shortages that you were talking about. Jobs. People went into Tahrir Square a year ago so that they could create economic opportunity for themselves and their children. They saw no forward momentum, Rosemary, on that. And I think that's what snapped public patience, just as much as his failures politically. He did not get how important it was to invest in the economy, create jobs, and spur growth. Now, a year is a very, very short time for anybody to meet Egypt's economic challenges.
What happens, though, Mohamed El Rashidy, if, say, 6 months they do get another election, someone is democratically elected again? Is there not a message here today to Egyptians that if you are not happy, you can go into the streets and you can topple even a democratically elected president? And what prevents this from happening again?
That's the question of the day, is the precedent that this sets. And that is the main reason I was apprehensive about the idea of Tamarrud, the June 30th protest, from the beginning, that they want to remove him through these protests. But when you look closely to the situation and you see over 20 million people going on the streets, such a mass uprising that is throughout society, throughout all the provinces, throughout all the institutions that already exist, the judiciary, which some will say is corrupt, but they were not for Morsi. The police force, okay, they may be corrupt. They're not. He lost them even though he hired the minister in charge. The military, even though he hired a new military head, he ended up turning against. Everybody turned against Morsi. So if you get 20 million people angry enough on the street to do this,
the problem is, Mohammed, I can just imagine 9 months from now, there's a new president democratically. 18 months from now, the Egyptian economy is still terrible. And you bring out mass protests on the street, and the army are in a terrible position. One of the things that makes made the army move, of it, but one of, not the only, was the fear of violence. When you have large demonstration between opposing camps, there's the high probability of civilian deaths. And there's no question that that was one of the factors that made them finally move out of the barracks, which they really did not want to do. But you're absolutely right, Rosemary. We could be here 2 years from now having a similar conversation. That's the worrying part about what happened.
Democracy takes a long time to take root.
Sure does.
It is not as easy as you might hope that it would be. Mohamed El Rashidy, yes.
But Rosemary, the point here is winning an election is not a carte blanche. I think we sort of have this fallacy in democracy that only the ballot box is the only way to bring about change or the only way to have a leader that's representative of the people. Absolutely, that is great when you have these institutions in place. But from now on, certainly a president of Egypt, and this is a lesson for people everywhere around the world, if the politician turns against his promises, obviously lies, and enough people are angry, instead of just turning your head and saying, oh well, at best I'll get him at the next election, at worst I'll forget about it, like the example in Egypt, no, we're going to fire you, and there's enough of us that believe that, and they go to the streets and they make it happen. That should be a lesson to all politicians.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting conversation you could have around the world. You're quite right. Is it an election, does it equal democracy? Can we just sort of bring it back home if we can? And I just want to show you a statement that we got from Foreign Affairs Minister's office, John Baird. He's in China, but this is a statement that we got from his press secretary, Rick Roth, saying the following, quote, Canada urges all parties in Egypt to remain calm, avoid violence, and engage in meaningful dialogue. Canada firmly believes that implementing a transparent democratic system that respects the voices of its citizens, that encourage and respects the contributions of civil society and all other segments of the population, including religious minorities, is the best way to restore calm and give all Egyptians a stake in the future stability and prosperity of Egypt. That again from Rick Roth, the press secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs, who is in China. And we spoke to Deepak Obrai, his parliamentary secretary, earlier. Obviously, countries watching this from afar have to be very careful in how they tread, I would imagine, in the coming days. What do you think that statement says about how Canada moves forward, that it didn't consider Morsi legitimate, that it thinks democracy, an election will bring about democracy next time round? Janice Stein?
Rosemary, I don't think it's fair to say that our government did not think Morsi was legitimate. I think this is a statement that comes out after he's already removed from office. Yeah. So he's gone. Right? So there really are 2 or 3 key messages here. One is urging the new government to move as quickly as possible towards new elections and a recommitment to democracy. 2, an emphasis on civil society and how important that is. And that reflects what Mohamed has been saying. You had 20 million people in the streets. You can't pretend that didn't happen. And the third, and I think interesting comment, was about religious minorities, which has not received a great deal of attention from many other countries. But it's, we in this country say it's how you treat your minorities that shapes the quality of your democracy, that is the measure of your democracy. So it's not surprising that we would hear that from our government. That's a very different message than the United States has been struggling with for the last 48 hours, frankly.
Yeah, and we'll continue, I think, to see it struggle and decide how to move forward. Thank you both so much. You both helped put this into perspective. I thank you both very much for your time. Mohamed El Rashidy, Vice President of the Canadian Arab Federation; Janice Stein, Director of the Munk School of Global Affairs. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Rosemary.
Okay. Bye. A reminder, we want to hear from you, as we always do. You can see the comment board on your screen right now. All the ways you can get in touch with us. Be part of the conversation on power and politics as we continue to cover this incredible story on today's coup in Egypt. Next, though, we're going to go to Vancouver. Remember,